This video was sponsored by the Great Courses Plus. It's May of the year 326 BC. The unbeaten Macedonian army invades the Punjab region of the Indian subcontinent. Despite the pouring rain, the insatiable Alexander, king of Macedon, Asia and Persia, stands on the western bank of the Hydaspes river, considering how to overcome the next daunting challenge waiting for him on the other side of the river. His last great battle against a formidable Indian king and his vast army is just about to happen. It's spring of the year 330 BC. With the troublesome crossing of the Zagros Mountains behind, the Macedonian army reaches its final destination, the city of Persepolis. Alexander quickly discovered that a good part of the royal treasury had been moved to Ecbatana in Media, where defeated King Darius struggled to form yet another army. The Macedonian king had taken the majority of the most important Achaemenid cities and decided to celebrate the Persian New Year in the just captured capital. He requested local aristocracy to pledge allegiance to his rule, but only a few nobles together with freshly appointed satraps attended the festivities. It became obvious that despite naming himself king of Asia, Alexander's claim to the Persian throne needed to be beyond reproach. The only way to do that was by killing Darius, who still formally remained king of Persia. Prior to his departure for Ecbatana, Alexander burned and looted Persepolis, wanting to avenge the Persian capture of Athens 150 years earlier. The pursuit had begun. The Macedonians arrived at Ecbatana in June, only to learn that Darius was no longer there. The Persian king was well informed regarding his enemy's movement and left the city some days earlier, marching northeast with his treasuries and followers, hoping to reach the yet unconquered easternmost part of the empire. Still, there were subjects willing to obey royal authority, but upon learning of the Macedonian chase, Darius's ranks began to thin out due to desertions. Eventually, he was arrested by his courtiers led by Bessus, satrap of Bactria, who hoped that handing the Persian king over to the Macedonians would avert the conquest of their eastern provinces. Yet Alexander turned down the disloyal satrap's offer. It was probably a better choice regarding his claim to the Persian throne, as Bessus then killed Darius. While Darius was buried in Persepolis with all due honors, Bessus crowned himself as the new Persian king, under the name Artaxerxes. He expected the Macedonians to finally return to Europe, just like other reasonable invaders would do. But it wasn't the case for Alexander. Another extraordinary campaign began, and in the matter of 1 year, Alexander crossed and subjugated the vast plains of Central Asia. Around that time, the first serious fractures started to appear in the Macedonian war machine. After the conquest of Persepolis and death of Darius, many regular soldiers expected Alexander to return home, as 5 long years had passed since they crossed the Hellespont to fight the Persians. Moreover, it looked like their beloved king had changed. He often demanded godlike treatment, took over many of the Persian customs, and surrounded himself with Persian advisors. He also became gradually more suspicious. When a plot against his life was discovered, he put one of his commanders, Philotas, on trial and had him killed despite the lack of sufficient evidence. It was a troublesome deed, as Philotas was the firstborn son of Parmenion, Alexander's trusted general and second in command. The execution of the son meant that the father must die too. Alexander hastily sent couriers back west with clear orders. Death met the old general in Ecbatana, where he guarded the royal treasury and supervised reinforcements. Parmenion remained loyal to the last. In the meantime, Alexander's troops were about to cross the Hindu Kush range, one of the last obstacles on their way to attack Bessus's domain. It was late winter, and Bessus didn't believe that Alexander would risk marching through the snowy mountain passes, yet it soon became clear that he once again underestimated the Macedonian king. Alexander managed to cross the mountains unopposed with minor losses to manpower, and completely surprised Bessus. Soon, the Macedonian acquired Bactria, forcing the usurper to flee north of the river Oxus. But nothing could stop Alexander. Despite Persian efforts to disrupt his progress, he marched through the desert, crossed the river, and directly confronted Bessus's force. Finally, the usurper was imprisoned by his own men, fearing the rage of the Macedonian king, and was handed over to Alexander. He was then tortured and crucified. Now, Alexander could crown himself as the unopposed king of Persia. He spent over a year quelling the unrest in his newly conquered lands. To calm the tribes inhabiting the eastern satrapies, Alexander married Bactrian princess Roxana. With the northeast border secured, he turned his eyes onto the populous and fertile lands of the Indian subcontinent. Probably the primary motivation for the new Indian campaign was Alexander's impertinence and uncontrollable desire for conquest, as the possible gains were dubious and the risk of failure was significant. Regardless, the Macedonian armies entered Punjab in late 327 BC and soon reached the lands inhabited by the Taxila people. Alexander was greeted by their king and soon expected all neighboring states to pledge allegiance to the new Macedonian overlord. Indeed, many local rulers bent the knee to the exotic invaders, but there was one chieftain on the other side of the Hydaspes river who refused to surrender. King Porus of the Poravians was a noble and courageous leader with a significant army and solid border in the form of a wide river. Of course, his refusal was totally unacceptable to Alexander, and soon the Macedonian troops reached the western bank of the Hydaspes. King Porus was already there, guarding the possible crossing. It was May, and he could easily stall for time. Melting snow in the Himalayas, together with upcoming monsoon rains, could render the river almost impassable for many months. Alexander knew this too, and tried to act as quickly as possible. Closer examination of the river convinced him that a direct crossing with the enemy guarding the other side was an easy way to lose his army. Another solution had to be found. Porus's troops patiently shadowed the Macedonian movements, who sought an opportunity to cross the river. In fact, this was just a feint to let the Indian guard down. Upon finding a suitable ford 30 kilometers upstream, he gathered his best units and during the stormy night transported them across the river. Porus couldn't believe the rumors about the Macedonian crossing and sent a 2,000-strong mounted detachment under his son to investigate. Young Porus encountered Alexander completing the crossing and decided to repel them immediately. Yet his brave charge was easily stopped by the Greeks, who after a short skirmish routed the Indian patrol. The young prince didn't survive the fight. Though he failed to stop the crossing, Porus at least learned that the enemy was now on the same side of the river and began deploying his troops. The Macedonian army was considerably larger, yet the majority of the troops were still on the west bank of the Hydaspes. Thus, Alexander's detachments, which crossed the river, were heavily outnumbered by the Indian army. Though their numerical advantage was partially diminished by the superior Macedonian training, discipline, and experience. Yet the Indians employed more than 100 formidable war elephants, which posed a serious threat to the Macedonian units, as it was the first time they had to face such an extraordinary enemy on the battlefield. The battle started with the attack of Scythian-hired horse archers, who tried to harass the elephants. Shortly, companion cavalry, led by Alexander, struck the Indian left flank. He tried to avoid the enemy's elephants, as Macedonian horses were not trained to fight such a threat. They feared these big animals and often refused to cooperate. The Sarissa phalanx reached the Indian line in the center and engaged the elephant units. Although their Sarissa spears were lengthened in order to fight elephants prior to the battle, they still had a tough time engaging them. War elephant units even managed to temporarily penetrate the Macedonian line here and there. King Porus saw that his left flank was clearly losing, so he sent chariots and cavalry from the right to aid the collapsing left. This was a clear signal for Coenus, commander of the remaining cavalry units. He quickly moved his mounted troops and rushed through the Indian right flank, encircled them, and attacked the left flank from the rear. Some of the elephant drivers in the center were killed, and the panicked animals fled, trampling their own infantry. Seeing that the enemy was slowly gaining an upper hand in the center, and especially on the left flank, a couple of infantry units started to waver and flee the battlefield. But they quickly realized that leftover Macedonian troops under Craterus had crossed the river and attacked the running Indians. Just after slaughtering the fleeing units, Craterus moved forward and engaged the Indian rear. King Porus, still fighting on his elephant, was aware that he had lost the battle, yet refused to surrender. Finally, he was captured, and the remaining part of his army avoided slaughter. The casualties on the Indian side were significant. Almost their entire cavalry and a good part of their infantry was killed, while the Macedonians lost around 1,000 soldiers, mostly in the center. King Porus, who was a humongous warrior over 7 feet tall, was asked by Alexander how he wished to be treated. He replied, "Treat me like a king would treat another king." Alexander was impressed by Porus's attitude and appointed him as the new satrap of Punjab. Although the Battle of Hydaspes River was the last major battle of the Macedonian king fought against a capable opponent, his story is yet to be concluded. If you don't want to wait until the next episode goes online, there's a neat way to learn more about Alexander and the empire he created. Our sponsor today, the Great Courses Plus, provides an insightful 18-hour-long series of lectures covering Alexander's achievements, titled Alexander the Great and the Macedonian Empire, taught by Professor Kenneth Hall. If that's not enough, there's another interesting collection of lectures about decisive battles throughout history worth checking out. The Great Courses Plus is a subscription, on-demand video learning service with top-notch lectures on history and various other topics, lectured by leading professors and experts from the world's best universities and research centers. If you want to support our channel and get 1 month's free trial, visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/BazBattles, or simply click the first link in the description.